August 2nd, 1944, outside Vire, France. Panzer IV Commander Karl Roth watches a Sherman racing down the dirt road at 15 miles per hour. He smirks. Moving targets can't shoot straight. His gunner waits for the Sherman to stop. But the Sherman's turret tracks them smoothly while bouncing over ruts. Then, a muzzle flash at full speed. The 75mm shell slams into their track. Metal shrieks. Smoke everywhere. As Roth bails out, he's screaming. How? They were moving. 3 seconds. One impossible shot. Everything he knew about tank warfare shattered. The smoke cleared slowly as Roth crawled away from his crippled Panzer IV, his ears still ringing from the impact. His loader Wagner was already in the ditch, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The Sherman kept rolling forward, not even slowing down to confirm the kill. It disappeared around the bend like nothing had happened, like destroying a German tank while driving at full speed was just another Tuesday for them. Roth had been fighting Americans for 2 months since they broke out of Normandy, and this was the 3rd time he had seen this impossible thing happen. At first, he thought it was luck. Then he thought maybe the Americans had some kind of special gunners, men with supernatural ability to compensate for their tank's movement. But 3 times was not luck, and no human could be that good. Back in training at Putlos, they had drilled the fundamentals into every tank crew until they could perform them in their sleep. You stop, you acquire your target, you fire, you move. That was the rhythm of tank combat. The British did it, the Russians did it, everyone did it because that was the only way to hit anything with a tank gun. When a tank moved, the gun bounced. When the gun bounced, shells went wild. This was not opinion but physics. The Sherman that just crippled his tank had violated the laws of physics, and Roth needed to understand how. He gathered his crew and started the long walk back to the assembly area near Vire, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the Americans had developed some new training technique, or maybe their tanks were different somehow from the older models they had faced in Africa and Italy. At the regiment command post that evening, Roth found he was not alone in his confusion. Lieutenant Hoffman from 3rd Company was describing an almost identical encounter from that morning. His panzer had been tracking a pair of Shermans moving through an apple orchard when one of them had snapped off a shot while crossing a drainage ditch at speed. The shot had blown Hoffman's cupola clean off, nearly taking his head with it. The battalion intelligence officer, Hauptmann Krebs, was taking notes and shaking his head. He had been collecting these reports for weeks now, trying to find a pattern. The Americans were hitting moving shots at rates that should be impossible, and it was happening too often to be coincidence. Krebs pulled out a captured American field manual they had taken from a destroyed Sherman the previous week. It mentioned something called a stabilizer, but the technical details were vague, and the translation was poor. The truth was hiding in plain sight inside every Sherman tank, a secret that American crews barely understood themselves. The M4 Sherman came equipped with a gyroscopic stabilizer, a complex mechanical system developed by Westinghouse in the late 1930s. It was not some wartime innovation, but actually predated the war itself. The stabilizer kept the gun elevated at the same angle regardless of how the tank pitched over rough ground. While it could not handle the side-to-side movement of the turret, it eliminated the vertical bounce that made firing on the move impossible. A Sherman crew that knew how to use their stabilizer could maintain their gun on target while racing across a field, something no German tank could do. The Panzer IV, the Panther, even the mighty Tiger tanks all had to stop completely to fire accurately. Their guns were more powerful, their armor thicker, but they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. The real irony was that most American tank crews never used the stabilizer properly. The system required careful maintenance and calibration that many crews skipped. Some commanders thought it was too complicated and told their gunners to ignore it. Others used it only as a rough aiming aid, getting the gun close to the target before stopping to fire normally. The U.S. Army had never developed proper doctrine for fighting on the move, and most training centers stateside barely mentioned the stabilizer at all. So while German tank crews lived in fear of an American advantage that seemed almost supernatural, most Sherman crews were leaving their secret weapon turned off. The few crews that did master the stabilizer through luck or experimentation or having the right instructor, were creating battlefield myths that spread through German ranks like wildfire. Karl Roth and his fellow tankers were being haunted by a ghost that barely existed, defeated by a capability their enemies did not even know they had. The gyroscopic stabilizer that terrified Karl Roth was not some rushed wartime miracle, but a piece of technology that had been sitting in American tanks since before Pearl Harbor. In 1937, engineers at Westinghouse Electric Corporation in Pittsburgh were working on a completely different problem. They were trying to develop better fire control systems for naval vessels, finding ways to keep big guns steady on ships rolling through ocean waves. One of their engineers, a man named Edward Ewell, realized the same principle could work for tanks. He built a prototype using a spinning gyroscope connected to hydraulic cylinders that would push against any vertical movement of the gun. When the tank went over a bump and the hull tilted up, the gyroscope sensed the change and immediately pushed the gun down by the exact same amount. The result was a gun that stayed pointed at the same spot, no matter how much the tank bounced. The U.S. Army tested Ewell's design at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland in 1938. The tests were remarkable. A Sherman equipped with the stabilizer could hit targets while driving at 15 miles per hour over rough ground that would make an unstabilized gun useless. The Army was impressed enough to order the stabilizer installed on all M4 Sherman production models starting in 1941. By the time America entered the war, every Sherman rolling off the assembly line had this advanced system built in. The stabilizer added about 200 pounds to the tank and cost roughly $800 per unit, which seemed like nothing compared to the advantage it provided. What the Army failed to do was tell anyone how important this device was or train crews properly on its use. The technical manual devoted just 3 pages to the stabilizer, buried between sections on track maintenance and radio operation. The device itself was ingeniously simple once you understood how it worked. At the heart of the system was a gyroscope spinning at nearly 20,000 revolutions per minute, powered by an electric motor drawing current from the tank's main electrical system. This spinning disc was mounted in gimbals that allowed it to maintain its orientation in space no matter how the tank moved. When the tank pitched forward going down a slope, the gyroscope stayed level. This difference in angle was detected by hydraulic valves that sent pressurized oil to cylinders attached to the gun mount. The whole system reacted in less than 1/10 of a second, faster than any human could possibly adjust the gun manually. The stabilizer could handle about 20 degrees of vertical movement, which covered everything except the most extreme terrain. The only limitation was that it worked only in the vertical axis. If the turret was rotating left or right, the stabilizer could not compensate for that movement. Training on the stabilizer at American tank schools was almost criminal in its inadequacy. At Fort Knox, where most Sherman crews learned their trade, instructors spent maybe 2 hours total on the stabilizer system. They showed trainees how to turn it on, how to check if it was working, and how to turn it off if it failed. What they did not teach was how to fight with it. There were no exercises for firing on the move, no doctrine for when to use stabilized fire versus conventional stopped fire, no maintenance schedules for keeping the delicate gyroscope properly calibrated. Many instructors had never seen the stabilizer used in combat themselves, since they were pulled from units that had been training stateside. They passed on their ignorance to new crews who then shipped out to Europe thinking the stabilizer was just another complicated gadget that would probably break anyway. The few crews who discovered the stabilizer's true potential usually did so by accident. Sergeant Tony Rizzo of the 3rd Armored Division was one of them. His driver had accidentally left the stabilizer engaged during a combat movement near Mortain, and Rizzo noticed his gunner was keeping the sight on target even while they bounced across a potato field. He ordered a shot fired more out of curiosity than tactical need, and watched in amazement as the round struck exactly where aimed. From that day forward, Rizzo's crew practiced firing on the move whenever they had spare ammunition. They developed their own techniques through trial and error. They learned to lead targets differently when moving, to account for their own speed as well as the enemy's. They figured out that the stabilizer worked best at steady speeds on relatively flat ground, and that sudden turns would throw off their aim. Within weeks, Rizzo's tank had nearly double the kill rate of other Shermans in his company, and nobody could figure out why. Meanwhile, German intelligence was desperately trying to solve the mystery of American moving fire. They interrogated captured tank crews, but most prisoners honestly said they never fired on the move because they had been trained not to. The Germans examined captured Shermans, and while they found the stabilizer hardware, they assumed it was just for rough aiming before stopping to fire. Nobody on the German side could believe the Americans had deployed such advanced technology and then failed to train their crews on it. It seemed impossible that such an advantage could be wasted through simple bureaucratic incompetence. Yet that was exactly what was happening. The U.S. Army had given its tank crews a revolutionary capability and then never told them it was revolutionary. The German High Command first noticed something was wrong in the after-action reports coming from Normandy in late June 1944. Tank commanders were claiming American Shermans were achieving impossible hit rates while moving at speed. At first, these reports were dismissed as excuses for poor performance. Oberst Wilhelm Decker, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, accused his subordinates of cowardice when they claimed American tanks were hitting them without stopping. He changed his mind after personally witnessing a Sherman destroy 2 of his Panthers while racing across an open field near Cannes. The Sherman never slowed down, just fired twice on the move, and both shots found their mark. Decker wrote in his official report that the Americans must have developed some new technology, but his superiors in Berlin thought he was making excuses for losing tanks to an inferior enemy. By August 1944, the reports were too numerous to ignore. The Wehrmacht conducted a formal investigation led by Major Friedrich Wenzel, a technical specialist who had studied at the Berlin Technical Institute before the war. Wenzel collected over 200 combat reports from different units across the Normandy front. The pattern was clear and consistent. American Shermans were hitting targets while moving at speeds between 10 and 20 miles per hour. The accuracy was not perfect, but it was far better than anything German crews could achieve. Wenzel calculated that a moving Sherman had about a 30% chance of hitting a stationary target at 500 meters, while a moving German tank had less than 5% accuracy at the same range. This difference was catastrophic in combat. It meant American tanks could advance under fire while maintaining offensive capability, while German tanks had to choose between moving or shooting. Wenzel ordered several captured Shermans to be sent to the testing ground at Kummersdorf for detailed examination. The technicians there found the gyroscopic stabilizer almost immediately, but they misunderstood its purpose. The German report described it as a comfort device designed to reduce crew fatigue by keeping the gun steady during road marches. They tested the system briefly and found it too delicate and complex for combat use. One German engineer wrote that the Americans were fools for adding such unnecessary weight and complexity to their tanks. What they failed to test was firing the gun while the stabilizer was engaged and the tank was moving. The very idea was so foreign to German tank doctrine that nobody thought to try it. The Germans had actually developed their own gun stabilizer before the war, but they had abandoned it as impractical. They could not imagine the Americans had succeeded where they had failed. The impact on German tank tactics was devastating, even though most commanders did not understand why they were losing. German doctrine called for tanks to use their superior guns and armor in defensive positions, moving between firing points but always stopping to shoot. This had worked brilliantly against Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front and British tanks in Africa. But against Americans in France, the tactic was falling apart. German tanks would take position and wait for Shermans to enter their kill zone. The Shermans would appear, but instead of stopping to engage, they would charge forward while firing. Even if most shots missed, some would hit, and the psychological effect was overwhelming. German gunners would rush their shots, knowing that every second they remained stationary, they were vulnerable to moving fire they could not match. The problem went all the way up to strategic planning. German officers had calculated their defensive lines based on how long it would take American tanks to stop, aim, and fire. These calculations were now worthless. A Sherman could suppress a German position while moving into close range where its inferior gun could penetrate German armor. The Panthers and Tigers still had better protection and firepower, but they were being neutralized by an advantage they did not understand. Some German units adapted by digging deeper positions and using more ambush tactics, but this meant giving up mobility and initiative. The mighty panzer divisions that had conquered France in 1940 were being reduced to static defense lines because they could not match American mobile fire. The most frustrating part for German intelligence was the inconsistency of American performance. Some Sherman units displayed devastating mobile fire capabilities, while others fought exactly like German tanks, always stopping to shoot. This randomness made it impossible to develop effective counter-tactics. A German commander never knew if the approaching Shermans would fight conventionally or display that terrifying ability to fire accurately on the move. This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Commanders held back reserves longer, worried about committing against an enemy with unknown capabilities. They kept their tanks in deeper cover, sacrificing fields of fire for protection against moving shots. Every tactical choice became a gamble, and the Germans were losing more often than winning. Major Wenzel submitted his final report in September 1944, concluding that the Americans had achieved a decisive technological advantage in tank warfare. He recommended immediately developing a German stabilizer system, but by then it was far too late. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, and German industry was collapsing under Allied bombing. The war would end with German tank crews still wondering how the Americans had done the impossible. The greatest irony of the stabilizer story was playing out inside American tank units across Europe. While German commanders were convinced they faced some kind of supergunners, most American crews were actively avoiding their stabilizer systems. Private Eddie Kowalski, a gunner with the 2nd Armored Division, remembered his first day in his Sherman outside of Cherbourg. His tank commander told him to forget everything he learned about the stabilizer in training because it was just going to break anyway. This was not unusual. A survey conducted by the Armored Force Board in November 1944 found that 70% of Sherman crews never turned their stabilizers on during combat. Another 15% used it only as a rough aiming device, getting the gun close to target before switching it off to fire. Only about 15% of crews actually used the system as designed, firing while moving with the stabilizer engaged. The reasons for this massive failure were numerous and interconnected. First was the maintenance problem. The gyroscopic stabilizer required careful calibration every few days to work properly. The gyroscope had to be balanced, the hydraulic fluid checked and refilled, and the electrical connections cleaned of dust and corrosion. In combat conditions with crews fighting for survival, this maintenance was often skipped. After a week without proper care, the stabilizer would start to drift, causing the gun to slowly move up or down on its own. Crews who experienced this drift usually just turned the system off permanently rather than fix it. The technical manual explained the maintenance procedures, but it required tools and testing equipment that many units did not have. Tank crews were already overwhelmed keeping their engines running and tracks repaired. Adding another complex system to their maintenance burden was asking too much. Training was an even bigger problem than maintenance. Sergeant Ray Turner, who trained tank crews at Fort Knox before shipping out to Europe, admitted after the war that he had never actually seen the stabilizer fired while moving during his entire time as an instructor. The training schedule allowed 40 minutes for stabilizer familiarization, which consisted mainly of turning it on and watching the gun stay level while the tank was rocked by hand. There was no ammunition allocated for moving fire practice. The Army assumed crews would figure it out in combat, but combat was exactly the wrong place to experiment with unfamiliar equipment. Crews stuck with what they knew, which was conventional tank gunnery. They had been taught to stop, aim, fire, and move, and that is what they did. The stabilizer seemed like an unnecessary complication that would only confuse things when seconds counted. Even when crews wanted to use the stabilizer, they faced institutional resistance. Many battalion and company commanders had been trained in the old National Guard tank units that used older tanks without stabilizers. These officers did not understand the technology and did not trust it. They gave orders that explicitly prohibited firing on the move because they thought it wasted ammunition. Captain James Morrison of the 3rd Armored Division actually court-martialed a tank commander for disobeying orders after the man successfully engaged German targets while moving. Morrison claimed the shots were lucky and the crew was being reckless. This kind of leadership ensured that even motivated crews would avoid using their stabilizers. The Army had spent millions of dollars installing advanced technology in every Sherman, then created a culture that punished soldiers for using it. The crews that did master the stabilizer often kept quiet about it to avoid scrutiny from higher command. They developed their own informal networks to share knowledge. Tank commanders would meet during resupply and quietly exchange tips about stabilizer settings and firing techniques. They learned that the stabilizer worked best at steady speeds between 8 and 12 miles per hour. Faster than that, and the system could not keep up with the bouncing. Slower, and the tank became too easy a target. They discovered that traversing the turret while moving would throw off the stabilization, so they learned to keep the turret still and let the driver line up shots by steering the whole tank. These techniques were never written down in any manual. They were battlefield secrets passed from crew to crew like folklore. Some units developed such expertise that German intelligence identified them specifically as equipped with special tanks, not realizing every Sherman had the same capability. The Ordnance Department knew about the stabilizer problem, but felt powerless to fix it in the middle of a war. Major Robert Hughes, a liaison officer between the factories and the front lines, wrote dozens of reports begging for better training programs. He calculated that proper use of stabilizers could increase Sherman combat effectiveness by 40%, potentially shortening the war and saving thousands of lives. His reports were filed and forgotten. The Army was focused on producing more tanks, not teaching crews to use the ones they had. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the majority of Sherman crews had never fired their main guns while moving. They had fought the entire war with a revolutionary advantage locked away behind their ignorance and their leadership's conservatism. The Germans never learned this truth, going to their defeat believing they had faced a technological marvel that barely existed. The strategic implications of the stabilizer mystery extended far beyond individual tank battles. The German belief that Americans possessed superior mobile gunnery capabilities forced them to fundamentally restructure their entire defensive strategy in Western Europe. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, issued new tactical directives in September 1944 based on the assumption that American tanks could engage effectively while advancing. These directives called for deeper defensive positions, more elaborate tank obstacles, and a complete revision of the mathematical formulas used to calculate defensive firepower requirements. German planners had always relied on something called the engagement equation, which calculated how many defensive guns were needed to stop an attacking force based on the time attackers would be exposed while stationary to aim and fire. With Americans apparently firing on the move, this equation no longer worked. Defensive positions that should have been impregnable were being overrun because the attackers never stopped long enough to be destroyed. The impact rippled through every level of German planning. Battalion commanders started demanding twice as many anti-tank guns to cover the same frontage. Engineers were ordered to dig anti-tank ditches wider and deeper to force American tanks to stop completely. Precious resources were diverted from other sectors to create multiple defensive lines, each designed to account for American mobile fire capabilities. The Germans estimated they needed 30% more defensive forces to hold a line against Americans than against equivalent British or Soviet forces. This calculation was based entirely on a capability that most American tanks were not even using. The Wehrmacht was structuring its entire defense around countering a ghost weapon, pulling troops and equipment from critical sectors to defend against something that existed more in their fears than in reality. The psychological impact on German tank crews was perhaps even more significant than the tactical changes. Tank combat had always been about nerve and timing, knowing when to expose your vehicle for a killing shot. German crews had been trained to use their superior optics and guns to pick off enemies at long range. But against Americans who could supposedly fire accurately while racing toward them, this advantage evaporated. Gunners started firing too early, wasting ammunition at extreme ranges. Drivers became reluctant to move between positions, knowing they would be vulnerable while unable to return fire. The elite panzer units that had conquered most of Europe were becoming tentative and defensive. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front were requesting transfers after facing American tanks. They described a feeling of helplessness, being hunted by an enemy that had broken the fundamental rules of tank warfare. Meanwhile, American commanders were completely unaware of the psychological advantage they possessed. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, complained constantly about the timidity of his tank crews who would not push aggressively enough. He had no idea that his scattered successes with mobile fire were creating panic throughout the German command structure. Intelligence reports from captured German officers mentioned their fear of American moving fire, but these were dismissed as excuses for poor performance. American planners assumed the Germans were simply demoralized by Allied numerical superiority. Nobody connected the dots between the stabilizer system and German tactical behavior. The U.S. Army was winning battles with a weapon it did not know it had, against an enemy defending against something that barely existed. The few American units that had mastered stabilized fire were achieving remarkable results without understanding their impact on the broader war. The 4th Armored Division, which had several crews proficient with stabilizers, broke through German lines repeatedly during the drive across France. They attributed their success to aggressive leadership and superior logistics. In reality, their ability to suppress German positions while advancing was creating gaps in defensive lines that should have been impenetrable. One squadron of stabilizer-proficient Shermans could create the kind of breakthrough that would normally require a full battalion. But because the capability was not recognized or documented, these successes could not be replicated systematically. Other units attacking identical German positions would fail catastrophically, not understanding why the 4th Armored had succeeded where they could not. The long-term impact extended beyond World War II. After the war, the Soviets captured German reports about American stabilized fire and took them seriously. They began developing their own stabilizer systems, assuming the Americans had mastered something revolutionary. The British studied captured German assessments and accelerated their own stabilizer programs. Both nations were chasing an American capability that existed more in German nightmares than American doctrine. The United States, having won the war, saw no urgent need to examine why the Germans had feared their tanks so much. It was not until the Korean War, when American tanks faced Soviet-equipped forces, that the Army finally developed proper doctrine for stabilized fire. By then, the Soviets had caught up, having learned from German reports about an American advantage that America itself had never properly exploited. The stabilizer story became a perfect example of how technological advantage means nothing without the doctrine and training to employ it. The U.S. Army had accidentally psychological warfare through ignorance, creating fear with a capability they did not know they were wasting.